I'm Davy, and I'm awesome. And welcome to Davy's Awesome Wrestling, where I review wrestling-related things all from the perspective of a fan, not an insider. And this week, I'm going to be reviewing a documentary currently available on the WWE Network. I've actually been wanting to review this documentary for several weeks now, ever since we lost the bad guy, Razor Ramon, Scott Hall. This documentary was made in 2016, and it was directed by Kevin Dunn. The documentary, Living on the Razor's Edge, the Scott Hall story. It starts out how we would expect any documentary to start out, with Scott Hall talking about how he was a wrestling fan when he was a kid, and that's all he wanted to do. He grew up in the territory days, and actually even started wrestling in the territory days. So his big thing was moving from Maryland to Florida. And while living in Florida and not having any idea of how to get into the wrestling business, because it wasn't like it is now. Nowadays, go on the internet, look up a wrestling school. I would suggest do your research because there are a lot of rip-off schools out there. But find a school, get trained, and go from there. Back then, it was kind of like you just had to accidentally know a guy who would break you into the business. But of course, like many wrestlers, because he was a really big dude with a really big build, he ended up becoming a bouncer. And while being a bouncer, in an altercation while he was dating a girl they did not realize had a crazy ex-boyfriend, got into an altercation, guy pulled a gun on him, and he tells the story of how he accidentally, while wrestling the gun away from the guy, shot the guy in the back of the head, killing him, which is going to come back later. But then how he was finally able to meet some guys who would get him into the business, and his first big break being in the AWA, the American Wrestling Association, where he met DDP, who was a manager at the time, and Shawn Michaels, who was part of the Midnight Rockers at the time, and started tag teaming with Curt Hennig, and started helping him learn the ropes of how to really get over as a wrestler. But then, of course, AWA going down the tubes, he ends up getting a job at WCW with DDP as the Diamond Stud, which is where he met Kevin Nash, who at the time was Oz. Two of them would tag occasionally, because both of them were just kind of lower to lower mid-card guys. Which, when you think about it, is kind of crazy, because how do you have a guy who's 6'8" and a guy who's 7 feet tall, and they're mid-card guys? But how that led to him being so frustrated with WCW that he was going to quit wrestling altogether until his wife at the time got pregnant with their son. So he really wanted to make a go out of it, so basically started calling WWF. Calling and leaving messages for Pat Patterson once a week for over a year. But then finally, thanks to his old friend Curt Hennig, who was in the WWF at the time as Mr. Perfect, calling him and having him talk to Pat Patterson finally called him back, and after a year of trying, they worked out a deal for him to come in, where Vince McMahon and him sat down and created a character based on his favorite movie, Scarface. This is when Scott Hall would become, in my opinion, his best character ever, the bad guy, Razor Ramon. And as most of us who grew up around that time remember, Razor Ramon came in as a heel. You know, just a very arrogant guy that we all love to hate, but got to the point we loved to hate him so much that they couldn't keep him a heel. We just loved him so much they turned him babyface. And it was there that he became a 4-time Intercontinental Champion. In my opinion, if he never left WWF, he might have been a world champion. It's very documented that he's not what he calls a mark for himself, so he just really didn't care. If they wanted to put a title on him, great. If not, whatever. But of course, talking about his time in WWF, not only winning 4 Intercontinental Championships, which was the record at the time, but also forming the Clique, the infamous Clique, which mostly consisted of Scott Hall, Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, Triple H, and Sean Waltman. And then from time to time, we hear about like guys who were unofficial Clique members like Justin Credible and Rikishi back when he was Fatu, but for the most part, it was those 5 guys. But then, of course, his getting an offer from WCW for guaranteed money, which was unheard of back then. There was no guaranteed money in wrestling. In fact, most wrestlers would retire with nothing. But Vince McMahon believed in giving opportunities. The more you perform, the better you do, the more money you make. However, there were flaws to that. For example, if you got hurt, had to go home injured, you made nothing. Which, especially with the schedule they had back then, which was a lot more than they have now, which is still quite a bit, injuries were bound to happen. So at the time, Vince McMahon not doing guarantees, Scott Hall could not turn down the offer from WCW for guaranteed money to go to WCW and go to form one of, if not the most famous faction to ever grace wrestling, the New World Order. Now say what you want about how the New World Order ended, which I will. It ended horribly. It was such a horrible shell of its former self. But when it first started, it was the hottest thing in wrestling. Everybody was watching because we had to see what was going on with this. But this wasn't actually as fun for Scott Hall as most people would think. He actually got bored. He wasn't very excited because here was the problem. Working in WCW with their guaranteed money meant that's what they're going to make, and that's it. No matter what. So what's the motivation to perform more? What's the motivation to have better matches or have matches at all when they can just come out, spray paint a guy, and go home and still make their big checks? And this led to Scott Hall's real substance abuse problems. Before that, of course, he was taking pills and drinking just for fun, but this is when he started really getting dependent on it because he was getting depressed. Not to mention, as he had mentioned, he was never dealing with those old demons in the back of his mind of the guy he accidentally killed. He even said whether it was an accident or not, the guy was still dead. Also, a quote from this documentary that I really love was Scott Hall talking about people say money can't buy happiness, and nobody could tell you that's more true than someone with money, because he had a lot of money and he was miserable. This was around the time that his marriage ended, and he really started falling apart. In fact, WCW even tried to capitalize on it by making that a storyline of Scott Hall and his substance abuse problems, which every time they've done stuff like that, whether it was with Scott Hall or with Road Warrior Hawk in WWF, to me it's very distasteful. Then, of course, WCW going out of business, WWE buying out WCW, and bringing back the NWO with Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and Hogan, which they all said could have worked, but didn't. I don't know if I agree. I remember the moment that it was announced with Vince McMahon in that chair that said NWO on it and going like, this is going to be horrible. But Scott Hall's substance abuse problems getting even worse, to the point that right after the plane ride from hell, he was fired. Chronicling more of his life falling apart, even into that infamous match that floats on the internet where he went to an independent show, just really out of his mind. If you're a wrestling fan and you go on the YouTubes, I'm sure you've seen it. And if you haven't seen it, do yourself a favor and keep it that way. But him finally hitting rock bottom to the point that he started getting clean, which you can actually see in the documentary The Resurrection of Jake the Snake, which I will get to someday. But this one was more from Scott Hall and DDP's point of view of him coming over to live with Dallas for a while, getting clean, getting a surgery he very badly needed, then getting his body back into shape. And not only getting clean and getting his body back in shape, but finally getting the therapy he needed to deal with the incident that happened when he was younger and accidentally killing somebody. It is very well documented that a lot of people with substance abuse problems, they're self-medicating. And people keep trying to treat that, which is a symptom, instead of treating the disease, which is what's going on in there. Which, when Scott Hall finally came to that realization that he needed to deal with what was going on in here, the trauma he'd been living with, but not dealing with, and through getting clean and getting his mind right, he finally was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. So it was a documentary that, yes, had the tragedy of what happened with Scott Hall, but ended on a high note, which I love. Now, this was in 2016. It's now 2022, and earlier this year, Scott Hall passed away due to complications to surgery he had had when he'd had a heart attack, which was very sad. And yes, the rumors have been circulating that a few months prior to his death, he had started back up with the substance problems. I don't feel like that diminishes the story of Scott Hall in any way, shape, or form. People with substance abuse problems deal with them the rest of their life. And sometimes, yeah, they go back and forth. It happens. But for the most part, between the time he had started getting himself clean until a few months prior to his death, he was living his best life. Cleaner, sober, happier, and I'm glad he got to have that. Now, as far as this documentary goes, if you are a wrestling fan like me, you've probably heard all these stories before, with not only interviews from Scott Hall, but interviews with people around him at that time. Except for until this documentary, I never heard any of these stories about him accidentally killing a guy, which ended up kind of making it all make sense. Before this was unveiled, his substance abuse problems, a lot of us just chalked it up to, it was just another wrestler who partied too much. But there was a lot more to it than that. And I love a story of somebody being able to overcome their demons, which he had done. So based on that, if you are a fan of the bad guy, I recommend you check out this documentary, Living on a Razor's Edge, the Scott Hall story. So there you have it. That's my wrestling review this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure to hit like, hit subscribe, hit that little bell so you get notifications for when I post new videos, and leave a comment. Tell me what you thought of Living on a Razor's Edge, the Scott Hall story. Tell me some of your favorite memories of Scott Hall. Tell me what your favorite match of his is. For most of us, I think it's pretty obvious. Love you guys.